The house was empty in a way that only houses become empty when they have been filled with noise and chaos and the sounds of a family trying to hold itself together against impossible odds. The Mercer family home stood on the outskirts of a dying industrial town in western Pennsylvania, a place that had once thrived on steel mills and coal mines and the labor of men who believed that hard work was a contract with destiny, that if you showed up every day and did your job without complaint, the world would repay your loyalty with security. But the world had changed, or perhaps it had always been exactly as it was, and people had simply believed a story about itself that was no longer true. The contract had been broken. The promise had been abandoned. And James Mercer was left holding the pieces of a life that was crumbling faster than he could reassemble it. James Mercer had worked at the Riverside Steel Mill for 32 years. He had started as a teenager, barely old enough to be in the factory, learning the trade from his father who had learned it from his father, a dynasty of labor that stretched back generations, a family business that was not family-owned but family-committed, generation after generation believing in the same promise: work hard, stay loyal, prosper. For 32 years, James had kept that faith. He showed up early. He left late. He did work that was dangerous and exhausting and that left his body aching by the time he was 40, his hands scarred from equipment, his back permanently damaged from lifting, his hearing diminished from the constant noise of industrial machinery. He did this work for 32 years because the contract said he should, because the promise said that this was how you took care of your family, how you gave your children what they needed, how you built a life that meant something in a world that often seemed to mean nothing at all. Then in 2008, the world changed again. The economy collapsed. The stock market crashed. The housing market imploded. The entire system seemed to be grinding to a halt. The steel industry went into free fall. The mill that had employed 3,000 people at its peak was bought and sold by investment firms who looked at it not as a source of livelihood, but as an asset to be extracted, stripped, restructured for maximum profit extraction. Wages were cut. Benefits were eliminated. Jobs that had provided middle-class stability were transformed into positions that barely paid minimum wage. James watched his annual income drop by 30% in a single year. He watched it drop again the next year by another 20%. He watched it drop a third time, each cut like a blade, each reduction another month shortened from the length of time he could maintain his family's existence in the house they owned, with the heat they needed, with the food they required to survive. By December 2008, James was working 72-hour weeks for wages that would have been poverty level if he was working a standard 40-hour schedule. The math was brutal and simple. He worked more hours for less money, and even with the sacrifice, there was not enough. There was never enough. The mortgage payment consumed a third of what remained after taxes. Electricity and heat consumed another portion. Food for 3 children and 1 exhausted adult consumed another significant piece. By the time he calculated what remained after these essential expenses, there was nothing. Zero. An empty calculation where he desperately wanted there to be something, some number that represented hope or possibility or the ability to provide his children with the Christmas that they deserved, that every child deserved. His wife Mary had died 2 years earlier, suddenly and completely, a stroke that came without warning and left James alone to parent 3 children. Lucy, who was 8 and old enough to understand hardship in ways that children should never have to understand it, who had already learned to be quiet so as not to add to her father's burden. Tom, who was 6 and still believed, at least on most days, in a world that made sense and contained justice, and that if you were good and worked hard, things would work out the way they were supposed to. And Emma, who was 2 years old and had no memory of her mother, who had been born into a world that was already broken, but who did not know this yet because she was still small enough to believe that her father's love was sufficient protection against anything the world could do. James worked those 72-hour weeks with the kind of desperation that comes when you understand that your maximum effort is not sufficient, that you are trying as hard as you possibly can, and it is still not enough. He came home in the pre-dawn darkness, exhausted in a way that sleep could not repair, and he made breakfast for his children. He walked them to the bus stop. He worked another shift. He came home again in the afternoon and tried to be a father, tried to help with homework, tried to read bedtime stories even though his eyes could barely stay open, even though every word was a battle against exhaustion, even though all he wanted to do was sleep. He worked another shift at night. He slept in fragments, his dreams interrupted by the constant mathematics of insufficiency, the endless calculation of how many days he could maintain this pace before his body simply stopped working, before his mind broke under the weight of impossible choices. Christmas 1994 was approaching, and for the first time in his adult life, James understood that he would not be able to give his children Christmas. Not the commercialized, extravagant Christmas that Americans were supposed to give their children, but not even the basic Christmas, the modest Christmas that included a tree and a few gifts and the sense that the world was not entirely made of scarcity. There would be no tree. There would be no gifts. There would be barely enough food for the holiday meal, and what food there was would come from careful shopping at discount stores, from using food stamps in ways that made James feel ashamed even though he knew he should not feel ashamed, even though he understood on an intellectual level that this was not his fault, that the system had failed him, not the other way around. On Christmas Eve morning, James sat at the kitchen table while his children slept upstairs, and he did the calculations again, as if somehow the numbers might have changed overnight, as if mathematics might suddenly prove to be negotiable, as if he might have missed something in his calculations that would change everything. He had $237 to his name. His mortgage payment was due in 6 days, and it was $1,300. His electric bill was past due. His car needed repairs that he could not afford. The children's school would want donations for the holiday party that he could not make. His oldest daughter, Lucy, had mentioned very casually, in that way that children mention things when they are trying not to burden their parents, that her best friend's mother had taken her to buy a new coat because her old coat no longer fit. Lucy had not asked for a coat, but she had mentioned it, and James understood that mention was a kind of asking that his daughter was trying to tell him something he could not provide, was expressing a need that he could not meet. He wept at the kitchen table, quietly, his shoulders shaking silently, because he did not want to wake his children, because he could not bear for them to see his failure, could not bear for them to know the depth of his desperation. He was failing them, not through any fault of his own, not through laziness or poor choices or moral failings, but through circumstances that were beyond his control. He was failing them because the world had arranged itself in such a way that his maximum effort was not sufficient, and this knowledge was more painful than anything he had ever experienced. Lucy found him at the table when she woke. She was 8 years old, and she had already learned the calculus of hardship, had already understood that her father was struggling, had already internalized the lesson that children learn too early when they are poor, that they should try to take up less space, to require less, to ask for less, to somehow make themselves smaller, so that their father would not have to carry so much weight. She put her small hand on his shoulder and said, in a voice that was too careful, too aware of its own burden, "Dad, it's okay if there's no Christmas this year. I don't mind. I understand." The statement broke something in James. This 8-year-old child, who should have been thinking about nothing but toys and television and the magical morning that Christmas morning was supposed to be, was instead thinking about her father's burden, was trying to lighten it for him, was offering him permission to fail. He pulled his daughter into an embrace and held her while tears ran down his face, and in that moment, something shifted in him. Not his circumstances, which remained unchanged, but his understanding of what he needed to do. He needed help. He needed to admit that help was necessary. He needed to ask. That afternoon, James walked into St. Catherine's Church, the Catholic parish that served the neighborhood, even though James was not a religious man. He had not been to church regularly in years. He had worked too many hours to develop the habit of Sunday worship. But the church existed, and a priest existed, and in the calculus of desperation, the church was the only place that James could think to go where help might be offered without expectation of repayment, where a stranger might listen to his story and not judge him for his failure. He sat in the confessional and told Father McCarthy, not his sins, but his situation. He told the priest about his wages and his mortgage and his children and Christmas. He told Father McCarthy that he could not provide Christmas for his children, and that this failure was destroying him more than any other failure he had ever experienced. He told the priest that he did not know what to do, that he had exhausted every option he could think of, that he was out of ideas and out of time and out of hope. The confession was not a religious confession. It was a human confession, a breaking open of the walls that pride had constructed around him over decades of work. Father McCarthy was an old man in his mid-70s, with gray hair and a face that showed the wear of decades of listening to people's pain. He was not a wealthy man. The parish was not wealthy. They existed in a community that was economically struggling, and they served people who were economically struggling. But Father McCarthy understood something about community that James had forgotten in his years of isolated struggle. He understood that communities were supposed to function as mutual aid societies, that the point of belonging to a community was that people helped each other when help was needed, that this was not charity in the sense of giving to strangers, but rather the basic function of how human beings were supposed to relate to each other. "I can help you, James," the priest said. "But I need your permission to share your story with the parish. There are people in our community who have resources, who are blessed to have more than they need. These people are waiting for an opportunity to help. They don't know where to go or how to do it. All they need is someone to help, and you can be that person. You can be the one who allows them to express their generosity. You can be the answer to someone else's prayer to be useful." James resisted this at first. The pride of a man who had worked his entire life, who had built his identity around self-sufficiency, around the idea that he was a provider and not a recipient, fought against the knowledge that he needed help. But he thought of his daughter Lucy, of her small hand on his shoulder, of her trying to give him permission to fail. He thought of Tom and Emma. He thought of Christmas morning, and then he let go of his pride enough to say yes, to allow Father McCarthy to share his story with the people in his parish. What happened next was not orchestrated from any official hierarchy. It was not the result of any formal charitable organization with staff and budgets and strategic plans. It was simply what happened when people in a community understood that one of their own was drowning. It was what happened when community meant something real, when belonging to a place meant responsibility for the other people in that place. Sarah Chin was 43 years old and worked as a registered nurse at Riverside County Hospital. She had never married. She had no children of her own. She had moved through her adult life competently and professionally, and with a fundamental loneliness that she did not allow herself to examine too closely. When Father McCarthy called her on December 15, 1994, and told her about the Mercer family, something in Sarah's life shifted. She said yes before she had fully thought about what yes meant. And then she began making calls. Michael arrived at the Mercer house on December 20th, ostensibly to fix an outlet. While he was there, he looked around and noticed the problems: a furnace running inefficiently, weather stripping deteriorating on the windows, a roof that had minor leaks, insulation that was inadequate. He began fixing these problems. Linda arrived on December 22nd with 4 large boxes of children's items. A woman from the grocery store came with food. A man who worked at the hardware store came with supplies and materials. A group of women from the parish came and cleaned James's house. Word spread through the community about the family that needed help, and the help came not in an organized wave, but in a steady, continuous stream. On Christmas Eve evening, Sarah arrived at the Mercer house with a Christmas tree. Not a small tree, but a full, beautiful tree, real and fragrant with the smell of pine, with lights already strung through its branches. She also arrived with her arms full of presents wrapped in cheerful paper. James stood in his living room and looked at this tree, and something inside him finally broke open. He understood finally that he was not alone, that he did not have to carry this burden entirely on his own shoulders, that community meant something real. That Christmas morning, Lucy woke before dawn and came to her father's bedroom. They went downstairs together. When Lucy saw the tree, when she saw the presents arranged around it, when she understood that Christmas was real after all, her small face transformed in a way that James would remember for the rest of his life. An expression of joy so profound, so genuine, that it seemed to contain all the beauty and magic that the world could offer. Tom woke to her excitement and came downstairs. Emma came down in her father's arms. They opened presents together. They ate a breakfast that included fresh fruit and eggs cooked in butter. At some point during that day, Sarah arrived with Michael and Linda and Father McCarthy and a dozen other people from the parish. They came and they sat at the Mercer family table and they shared Christmas dinner. They brought dishes of food and themselves, their presence, their willingness to be part of this family's Christmas. Over the following months and years, Sarah became increasingly integrated into the Mercer family's life. She came for dinners. She helped Lucy with homework. She sat with Emma and read stories. She was not trying to replace Mary, but she was offering something different, something new. The proof that a family could expand, that love was not a finite resource but something that could be generated anew, offered fresh, in different forms. James fell in love with her gradually, not as a sudden revelation but as a slow recognition that she was offering something that he needed more than pride or independence. When he finally asked her to marry him, it was on an ordinary Tuesday evening in the kitchen where they cooked dinner together, not as a grand gesture, but as a simple statement of need and desire and recognition of what mattered most. They married 18 months later, in the spring of 1996. Michael was his best man. Linda was Sarah's maid of honor. The wedding reception was held in the church basement with food brought by community members. It was not an elaborate wedding, but it was rich with meaning, with the presence of people who had made the decision to help them and who were now celebrating their union. Their marriage changed everything. Sarah's nursing income provided stability that James had never experienced. But more importantly, their partnership changed the narrative. From being a family in crisis, they became a family that was stable, secure, able to think about the future. Lucy thrived in school. Tom began to develop the emotional tools to process the trauma of poverty. Emma grew up with a sense of security, with parents who loved her completely, with the knowledge that family was something that could be built, could be created, was not limited to biology. The idea for the Circle of Mercy came to Sarah one evening while she was working a night shift at the hospital. She was caring for a young man who had attempted suicide because he could not provide Christmas for his 2 children. Sarah found herself thinking about how close the Mercers had been to this same tragedy, how many families in her community were sitting at their own kitchen tables right now doing exactly what James had done. Calculating and finding the calculation did not work. She proposed the idea to James. She proposed it to Father McCarthy. She proposed it to Michael and Linda and the others who had worked together to save the Mercer family's Christmas. They began meeting regularly, discussing how to systematize what had been spontaneous, how to create a framework that would make it possible for their community to help multiple families, to extend help beyond their personal networks into the broader community. The Circle of Mercy began in 1996 with a modest budget, mostly from private donations supplemented by some fundraising. By Christmas of their first year of formal operation, the Circle of Mercy was able to provide assistance to 47 families. By the second year, that number had grown to 93. By the 5th year, 300 families. By 2024, the Circle of Mercy had distributed millions of dollars in assistance. When strangers became family, the Christmas that saved lives. This is the story of what happens when people decide that community means something, that responsibility extends beyond family bonds, that we are all connected. This is the Christmas that proved that ordinary people could do extraordinary things simply by deciding to help one another. James and Sarah understood that what had happened to them was not a miracle in the supernatural sense, but rather the result of human beings choosing to see their community as something worth fighting for. Their story began to spread through the region as newspapers picked up the narrative of how a community had transformed a family's desperation into hope. The local journalist who first covered the story was moved by what she witnessed. She saw not just charity, but something deeper, a transformation of human consciousness, a moment when people recognized their connection to each other. The Circle of Mercy formalized what had been spontaneous. It created structures through which the impulse to help could be channeled and organized. Volunteers began meeting in the parish basement. They created lists of families in need. They organized gift drives. They coordinated food donations. They created a system for connecting donors with recipients, but always in ways that preserved the dignity of both parties. The organization understood that receiving help could be humbling, and they worked to frame assistance not as charity but as community care, as the basic function of how communities were supposed to work. By the year 2000, 6 years after the original Christmas of 1994, the Circle of Mercy had expanded significantly. They were helping over 200 families each Christmas season. The annual budget, which had started at just a few $1,000s, had grown to nearly $50,000. Volunteers numbered in the hundreds. Local businesses began to contribute. The mayor included the Circle of Mercy in the city's official holiday festivities. What had started as one person's phone calls had evolved into an institution, yet it retained the heart and soul of its origins. The belief that community meant responsibility, that the suffering of strangers was not acceptable, that people had the power to change circumstances when they chose to act. Lucy Mercer grew up in this environment of community service. She watched her father transform from a desperate man working 72-hour weeks into a man who was secure, who had time for his children, who had energy for living. She watched her stepmother Sarah organize the distribution of Christmas gifts to families who had been in the same situation that her family had been in. She understood, in the way that children understand such things, that gratitude was not enough. Gratitude was just a starting point. Real gratitude meant paying it forward, meant using your own good fortune to help others in similar circumstances. By the time Lucy was in high school, she was already volunteering with the Circle of Mercy. She helped coordinate gift distribution. She worked in the warehouse where donated items were sorted and packaged. She met families who had been helped by the organization, who had gone from crisis to stability just as her own family had. She began to understand that her personal story was not unique, that it was one of many stories of transformation, that the world contained many families on the edge of catastrophe who could be saved by community action. When Lucy went to college, she studied social work. She wanted to understand the systems that created poverty, that made it so difficult for people to survive, that required the kindness of strangers in order for a family to have Christmas. She wanted to understand not just how to help people in crisis, but how to create systems that prevented the crisis from occurring in the first place. She became passionate about policy work, about changing the structures that left people like her father vulnerable to catastrophic failure when industries collapsed. Tom Mercer, her younger brother, took a different path, but arrived at a similar destination. He became fascinated by the psychology of poverty, by how the stress of financial insecurity affected people's mental health, their ability to function, their relationships with their families. He went to graduate school to study clinical psychology. He wanted to work with families in economic crisis, to help them process the trauma of uncertainty and inadequacy that came with not having enough money to provide for basic needs. Emma Mercer, the youngest, grew up without memory of struggle. She had no memory of the Christmas of 1994. She had no memory of her father's desperation. But she had grown up in a household where service was normal, where helping others was expected, where the family regularly participated in Circle of Mercy activities. Emma became interested in nonprofit management. She wanted to learn how to run organizations like the Circle of Mercy, how to manage volunteers, how to make the most effective use of limited resources. By 2010, 16 years after the original Christmas, the Mercer family was deeply integrated into the leadership of the Circle of Mercy. Sarah had become the executive director. James, who had finally retired from the mill, worked part-time as the community outreach coordinator. Lucy, now in graduate school for social work, volunteered as the supervisor of the Christmas gift distribution program. Tom, still in school, helped with counseling and mental health training for volunteers. Emma, still in college, was beginning to work as an intern in the administrative offices. The Circle of Mercy had grown beyond what any of its founders could have imagined. They were now helping over 1,000 families each year. They had chapters in 3 neighboring cities. They had an annual budget of over $1 million. They had professional staff alongside volunteers. They had a formal board of directors. They had a building of their own instead of meeting in the church basement. But the core mission remained unchanged: to believe that community was real, that people had responsibility for each other, that Christmas could be made real for families who would otherwise face the holiday in desperation. The newspaper that had originally covered the story of the Mercer family in 1995 ran a retrospective in 2009, 15 years later. The article was titled, "What Happened After the Miracle." It told the story of what had grown from one community's decision to help one family. It described the thousands of families who had been helped. It interviewed people whose lives had been transformed by the Circle of Mercy. One woman talked about how the organization had helped her keep her children during a period of economic crisis. A man talked about how the gifts his kids received at the Circle of Mercy's distribution event made him feel like he was not a complete failure as a father. A teenage girl talked about how the community support her family received showed her that the world contained good people. The article also highlighted the question that had become central to discussions about the Circle of Mercy. Why should charitable organizations have to exist to provide basic dignity during the holidays? Why was it acceptable that families were choosing between paying for heat and paying for food? Why had the system been arranged in such a way that people like James Mercer could work 72-hour weeks and still not have enough? These were political questions, questions about the structure of society, questions about how resources were distributed, questions about what communities owed to their members. Sarah gave an interview for that retrospective. When the journalist asked her why the Circle of Mercy was important, Sarah spoke from experience, from her understanding of what it meant to be helped, what it meant to be part of a community that recognized your personhood and your dignity even in moments of crisis. "We exist because people decided that their neighbors were worth helping," Sarah said. That sounds simple, but it's actually revolutionary. In a world that tells us to look out for ourselves, that tells us that other people's problems are not our responsibility, we decided that community meant something different. We decided that if one of us was drowning, we all threw out a rope. The Circle of Mercy didn't create that decision. It just organized it, made it systematic, allowed it to grow. But the heart of it was always the same. People recognizing each other as part of the same community, as worthy of care and support. The journalist asked Sarah what she would say to people who thought that helping people like the Mercers was enabling them to avoid dealing with their own problems. "I would say that James Mercer worked harder than anyone I know," Sarah responded. "He worked 72-hour weeks for poverty wages. He did everything he could possibly do. The system failed him. When we helped his family, we weren't enabling him to avoid his problems. We were saying that his maximum effort was valuable, that his work mattered, that his family deserved to have Christmas even in circumstances beyond his control. We were saying that community care wasn't about judgment. It was about recognition of shared humanity." By 2015, 2 decades after the original Christmas, the Circle of Mercy was recognized as a model for community organization. Universities used it as a case study in nonprofit management classes. Community organizers from other regions came to learn how the organization had grown. Foundation grants came to support replication of the model in other communities. The organization that had started with one woman's phone calls had become a national organization with regional chapters. But James and Sarah maintained that the real work was not organizational. It was personal. It was about showing up at a family's door with gifts. It was about serving them Christmas dinner. It was about creating moments of joy for children who were living in circumstances of scarcity. The infrastructure mattered. The systematic approach mattered. But what mattered most was the human connection, was the decision to be present to someone else's suffering and to do something about it. In 2024, James Mercer passed away at the age of 85. He had lived to see his community transformation grow beyond anything he had imagined. He had lived to see his children become adults dedicated to service. He had lived to know that the desperation he had felt on that Christmas Eve in 1994 had been transformed into hope, not just for his family, but for thousands of other families. His legacy was not just economic security or professional accomplishment. It was the understanding that he had demonstrated through his life, that asking for help was not weakness, that receiving help was not failure, that being part of a community meant both giving and receiving, taking turns being the one who helps and the one who needs help. Sarah continued leading the Circle of Mercy after James's death. She was 91 years old by then, still working part-time, still giving interviews, still believing in the power of community. When asked by journalists to reflect on her life and the work she had done, Sarah always returned to the same central insight. I was saved by strangers, she would say. Not by divine intervention. Not by luck. Not by government programs or corporate charity. I was saved because people in my community decided that I mattered, that my family mattered, that my desperation was their business. And that salvation changed everything. It showed me that the world was not made of isolated individuals pursuing selfish interests. It showed me that humans could create communities of care. It showed me that miracles were not supernatural events. They were simply what happened when enough people decided to help each other. Comment below. Have you been helped by your community? Have you helped someone who needed it? The Mercer family story is not about one special family or one unique act of kindness. It is about what communities can accomplish when they decide that responsibility extends beyond the boundaries of family. It is about understanding that Christmas itself is a human creation, a moment we create together, and that we have the power to make it real for everyone, not just those with enough money. This is the story of when strangers became family, when a desperate man found that people in his community were willing to help him, when an entire community transformed itself from individual actors into a network of mutual care. This is the story of what Christmas can mean when we stop thinking of it as a commercial holiday and start thinking of it as a reminder of our connection to each other, our responsibility to each other, our power to transform despair into hope through simple acts of caring. Remember this Christmas season, you have the power to change someone's life. You have the power to transform a child's Christmas from one of despair to one of magic. You have the power to say to someone in crisis that they are not alone, that their community cares about them, that they matter. That power exists in every person. That power can transform a world. When strangers became family, the Christmas that saved lives. Not just the lives of James and his 3 children, though it did save their lives, but also the life of Sarah Chin, who discovered through helping them that she had a capacity for love and service that she did not know she possessed. And the lives of thousands upon thousands of families who were helped by the Circle of Mercy, who experienced in their own lives the proof that community was real, that people could care about each other, that Christmas magic could be created not by shopping, but by showing up for each other. The legacy of the Mercer family story extended far beyond the city where it began. In 2011, a documentary filmmaker discovered the narrative of the Circle of Mercy through that retrospective newspaper article. She became fascinated by the idea that an entire organization had grown from one community's decision to help one family. She approached Sarah with the idea of creating a documentary film about the Circle's origins and impact. Sarah agreed, understanding that the story might inspire other communities to create similar organizations. The documentary, titled Strangers Became Family, premiered at a regional film festival in 2013. It told the story of James and Sarah's journey, from James's desperation to the founding and growth of the Circle of Mercy. It included interviews with families who had been helped. It included footage of Christmas gift distributions, of volunteers working in warehouses, of children opening presents and experiencing the joy that Christmas was supposed to bring. But most importantly, it told the story of the transformation that happened not just to the people being helped, but to the people doing the helping. The documentary showed Michael, the electrician, talking about how helping the Mercer family changed his understanding of what it meant to be a tradesman. He had always thought of his work as simply the jobs he was hired to do, the repairs he was contracted to make. But through helping the Mercer family, he realized that his skills were valuable not just in commercial transactions, but in community care. He began organizing a team of tradespersons who volunteered their labor for families in crisis, providing free repairs, free improvements, free skilled labor to people who could not afford it. It showed Linda, the teacher, talking about how she realized that her role was not just to teach children in school, but to care for her community. She began using her classroom to collect donations from her students' families. She began organizing teachers to contribute to the Circle of Mercy. She began teaching her students that they had responsibility to their community, that they were not just individuals but members of a larger social body. When her students graduated from high school, many of them continued to volunteer with the Circle of Mercy, carrying forward the understanding that they had responsibility to care for people beyond their own families. The documentary had a powerful effect. Community organizations in other cities watched it and began forming their own versions of the Circle of Mercy. Universities assigned it in nonprofit management classes. Social workers watched it and felt inspired to do their work differently, to remember that they were working with human beings who deserved dignity and respect. Political organizers watched it and thought about how to address the structural issues that made charitable organizations necessary. By 2015, 5 years after the documentary was released, there were Circle of Mercy chapters in 14 states. There were thousands of volunteers. There were tens of thousands of families being helped each year. The organization had grown to become one of the largest community-based holiday assistance networks in the United States. And it had all started from one community's decision to help one struggling family during Christmas 1994. The growth of the organization brought new challenges. How do you scale something that was based on personal relationships and community care? How do you maintain the intimate nature of help when you are helping thousands of families? How do you prevent charity from becoming bureaucratic, from becoming about checking boxes and distributing resources, rather than about genuine human connection? These were the questions that Sarah and the board of directors grappled with. Their answer was to maintain a dual structure: professional staff to handle logistics and administration, but volunteer relationships to handle the human connection. The professional staff ensured that gifts were purchased efficiently, that food was donated systematically, that resources were allocated fairly. But the actual delivery of those gifts and food was done by volunteers who sat at family tables, who heard stories, who made genuine human connections. The idea was that every family helped by the Circle of Mercy would experience not just receiving resources, but receiving recognition, being seen as worthy of care by their community. Lucy Mercer, by the time she was in her 30s, had become the director of community engagement for the Circle of Mercy. She worked with volunteer trainers to teach volunteers how to approach their work with sensitivity and respect. She created protocols for ensuring that the help was delivered in ways that preserved the dignity of the recipients. She developed a philosophy of assistance that recognized that receiving help was difficult, that it was challenging to ask for assistance, that the way help was given could either reinforce shame or could reinforce belonging. The Circle of Mercy, under Lucy's guidance, was designed to do the latter. Tom Mercer, now working as a licensed therapist, developed a mental health component for the Circle of Mercy. He recognized that poverty and financial crisis had psychological impacts, that people who were struggling economically often experienced depression, anxiety, shame, and despair. He created training programs for volunteers to recognize signs of mental health crisis and to connect families with mental health resources. He worked with local mental health providers to create a network through which people helped by the Circle of Mercy could access counseling and therapy. Emma Mercer, now the operations director of the Circle of Mercy, managed the day-to-day functioning of the organization. She oversaw the volunteers, managed the budget, coordinated the logistics of gift distribution, managed relationships with donors and community partners. She brought the same care to her work that her parents and siblings brought to theirs, understanding that the logistics mattered because people mattered, that doing the administrative work well meant that families could receive help efficiently and respectfully. The Mercer children understood that they were the second generation of their family's involvement in community care. They had grown up receiving help and witnessing the work of community service. They were now dedicating their professional lives to helping others in similar circumstances. And they raised their own children with the same values, teaching them that community responsibility was fundamental to what it meant to be a human being. By 2020, the Circle of Mercy was helping 10,000 families per year. The annual budget had grown to $5 million. There were professional staff in multiple cities. There were thousands of volunteers. The organization had expanded beyond just Christmas assistance to include year-round programming, summer camps for children, job training programs, financial literacy classes, mental health counseling, emergency assistance for crisis situations that arose outside the holiday season. When the COVID-19 pandemic began in 2020, the Circle of Mercy was tested in new ways. Families who had been marginally stable before the pandemic were suddenly plunged into crisis. Unemployment spiked. People lost income overnight. The need for assistance skyrocketed. The Circle of Mercy pivoted quickly to emergency assistance, helping families pay for rent, pay for utilities, pay for food during the period when traditional employment dried up. Sarah, by then in her mid-80s, coordinated the response from her home office. She worked with organizations in other states to share resources and strategies. She advocated to government agencies for emergency assistance to communities in need. She gave interviews to media outlets about what she was seeing on the ground: families falling into poverty, workers losing livelihoods, systems that had been inadequate before the pandemic now completely failing. She spoke out about the need for systemic change, for addressing the structural issues that made communities so vulnerable to economic catastrophe. And she maintained, throughout the pandemic crisis, the core belief that had guided the Circle of Mercy since its founding: that communities could care for their own, that people had responsibility for each other, that solidarity was not just a nice idea, but a necessity for human survival. By 2024, 30 years after the original Christmas, when strangers became family, the Circle of Mercy was one of the largest community-based assistance organizations in the country. It had helped over 1 million families. It had distributed over $50 million in assistance. It had influenced policy in ways that had created legal protections for workers, expanded unemployment benefits, increased funding for community organizations. It had demonstrated that communities could function as mutual aid networks, that people could care for each other when they chose to do so. Sarah passed away in 2023, at the age of 92. She had lived to see her original intuition, that the community could help the Mercer family, and that this help could transform into something larger, become a reality. She had lived to see the organization she helped found grow beyond her wildest imagination. She had lived to know that her life had made a difference, not just for the Mercer family, but for hundreds of thousands of families. At her funeral, attended by thousands of people whose lives had been touched by the Circle of Mercy, speakers talked about what Sarah had represented. They talked about her belief in community, her understanding that people were responsible for each other, her insistence that dignity was not something to be earned but something that every human being deserved. They talked about how she had transformed a single act of kindness into a movement, had taken something spontaneous and made it systematic, had believed that change was possible, and then created that change. Lucy, Tom, and Emma continued the work after Sarah's death. They maintained the Circle of Mercy as a living monument to their parents' legacy, to their understanding of what community could be, to the proof that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they decided that their neighbors' well-being was their responsibility. The story of the Mercer family and the Circle of Mercy became a touchstone in conversations about social responsibility, about community, about what we owe to each other. Universities taught it in classes about nonprofit management, about social work, about economics, about the philosophy of community. It was cited in policy papers about poverty and economic security. It was referenced in sermons and talks about the meaning of compassion and solidarity. It became proof that a different way of organizing society was possible, that communities could function as mutual aid networks, that people could choose to care for each other. And every Christmas, in communities across the country where Circle of Mercy chapters existed, volunteers went into neighborhoods with gifts, with food, with the knowledge that they were part of something larger, that they were embodying the values that Sarah and James and Michael and Linda and Father McCarthy had embodied 30 years earlier. The belief that strangers could become family, that community was real, that the work of caring for each other was the most important work there was. Comment below. Think about your own community. Who in your neighborhood is struggling during the holidays? What would it take for you to become the stranger who becomes family? What would it take for your community to organize itself around care for its members? The Mercer family story is not a story about exceptional people. It is a story about ordinary people who made extraordinary choices. It is a story about what is possible when enough people decide that community responsibility is real. This is the Christmas that proved that ordinary people could transform the world. Not through grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but through small acts of kindness, through networks of mutual care, through the decision to see strangers as family. This is the proof that another world is possible, that communities can function differently, that people can care for each other when they choose to do so. When strangers became family. The Christmas that saved lives. This is the story of what happens when people decide that community is not just a word but a practice, that belonging to a place means responsibility for the people in that place, that Christmas itself is a human creation, a moment we make real for each other. This is the story of transformation, of hope, of the power that exists in every community to change itself through solidarity and care. Remember this Christmas. You are part of a community. The people around you are your community. Their struggles are your struggles. Their joy is your joy. Your responsibility extends to them. And when you recognize that responsibility and act on it, when you decide to become the family to someone who started as a stranger, you participate in the same transformation that happened in that small town in Pennsylvania in 1994. You become part of the work of creating a more just, more caring world. You become proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. You become the Christmas miracle. The work of building community, of recognizing our responsibility to each other, is not something that happens once and then is complete. It is something that must be renewed each year, each season, each day. As the Circle of Mercy enters its 31st year of operation in 2025, it continues to face the fundamental challenge that prompted its creation. Families in the community remain vulnerable to economic crisis, remaining at risk of losing their homes, their heat, their food, their dignity during moments when they need help most. The story of the Mercer family reminds us that the work is not finished, that the need for community care does not diminish with time, that we must remain vigilant, remain committed, remain convinced that another way of organizing society is possible. The documentary about the Circle of Mercy, which premiered over a decade ago, continues to be shown in classrooms, in community centers, and nonprofit conferences. It continues to inspire people to think about their own communities, to ask themselves what responsibility they have to their neighbors, to consider whether they might become the stranger who becomes family for someone else. And so the story continues. In communities across the country, volunteers continue the work that began when Sarah Chin picked up a telephone and called people she knew to ask for help. They continue to deliver gifts, to provide food, to show up at family doors with the message that their community sees them, cares about them, recognizes their humanity and their dignity. They continue to transform strangers into family, despair into hope, isolation into connection. This is the true legacy of the Christmas of 1994. The proof that communities can function differently, that people can choose to care for each other, that the work of mutual aid and solidarity is possible, is real, and is essential to human survival and flourishing. When strangers become family, when people recognize their responsibility to each other, when communities organize themselves around care, that is when miracles happen. Not miracles of divine intervention, but miracles of human consciousness, human compassion, human choice.